Orville story, myth and legend. The history of Orville Abbey is legendary and mysterious. Orville is situated in the deep south of Belgium, in the Belgian province of Luxembourg. Nestled in a wooded area of the Ardennes called Gorme. The Abbey of Orville is the result of a long history dating back more than 165 million years ago, when the sea covered the whole area of the Ardennes, and in the depths of the water was already forming a yellow stone, ochre, French stone, that was used for the construction of the abbey. The valley that was to host the abbey was created 15 million years ago as a result of the glaciation. 3,000 years later, the first trees will appear, Scots pines, birches and beeches. A forest that man will deforest. Between 1800 and 1200 AC, near the abbey passed an ancient Roman road that connected Trier in Germany and reached Reims in Champagne. It is legitimate to think there may have been a Gallo-Roman settlement. In 1070, Benedictine monks from Calabria settled down. Tired of the continuous wars in Italy, they sought shelter far from their land. They arrived in Germany, where the Archbishop of Trier directed them to the Ardennes. Count Arnold II of Chiny, master of the feud to which Orville belonged, welcomed them and offered them his lands, creating a new land, so the first Benedictine community in Belgium. The monks were unlucky as they were tired of the continuous wars that afflicted Italy. They left their convent seeking shelter away from the native land, but from there soon the conflict would spread to the areas surrounding Orville. In spite of the conflicts that afflicted the whole of northern Europe, the monks did not lose heart and continued to build their church. The work could go on thanks to the exploitation of the mines of salt, which allowed him to meet the heavy construction costs. The beautiful Matilde di Canossa, Countess of Tuscany, 1046 to 1115, married Goffredo the Hunchback and was also the sister-in-law of Goffredo di Buglione, one of the historical figures who took part in the First Crusade. The marriage between Goffredo the Hunchback and the Countess Matilde di Canossa lasted a couple of years before he withdrew to his homeland. The Hunchback was assassinated on February 26, 1076, Antwerp, by a sailor of the port who said his name was Ricardo or Ronaldo, even though he did not motivate the murder. Matilde did not shed a tear for the death of her husband, who on several occasions called her the Pope's little counselor. The chronicles of the time would show that there was no longer any connection between Matilde and Goffredo. Therefore, what better occasion could be his murder away from home? It wasn't really known whether Matilde was the author of the death of Goffredo or at the hands of Count Roberto of Flanders or Baldo Vivo of France. Matilda had two tragic and painful events in the course of her life. The first was the death of her daughter as soon as she died, who was given a dignified burial behind the monastery near the Matildica fountain. The other tragic event was the loss of her 8-year-old son due to a fall into the icy waters of the river Semois. At this point, history becomes legend. In an attempt to alleviate her suffering, Count Arnold II of Chiny took Matilda of Canossa to see the work of the newborn monastery. After being heartened, she went to the abbey where there was a stream, dipped her hands in it, and in the trying to freshen up, the wedding ring slipped through her fingers. She looked for it in the mud since at that time the spring it wasn't channeled, but he couldn't find it. Desperate, she went to pray in the monastery oratory, begged the Virgin Mary to let her find him, and to her back to the source saw a trout emerge with a ring in its mouth. Matilde was impressed by this magic, exclaim, "This is a magic place I want," that is called Aurea Vallis, that over time changed into Val d'Or and later into Orville. In the following centuries a part of the stream was canalized and made accessible to all visitors. Today it is possible to visit the Abbey and discover the source of Mathilde's magical place that creates so much curiosity. After the assassination of Goffredo the Hunchback, Mathilde di Canossa became the most famous and powerful woman in the world of southern Europe, holding a very extensive domain. She was an ardent supporter of Pope Gregory VII, who strongly supported the conflict over the law on the investiture of bishops. The emperor, who in the meantime had been excommunicated, was unable to remove the fortress of Canossa where he was posted and protected the pope, after an interview with Mathilde herself, decided to follow the path of repentance and was forced to humiliate himself by going to the fortress in person, barefoot and without clothes. This historical event actually happened. Dates back to January 1077, from which the saying was coined, "Go to Canossa," exactly with the meaning of being forced to humiliate yourself and ask for forgiveness. 2 weeks after Henry IV, the war resumed with the Pope, who took refuge with the monks, bringing with him if even Mathilde, who lost most of her domains. It was not until late in 1111 that Matilda remarried with a young scion of the Dukes of Bavaria, who had always been an enemy of Henry IV. Matilde signed the peace treaty with Henry V, son and successor of Henry IV, returning in possession of his possessions, which included northern Italy, excluding Tuscany. The legend grows stronger and stronger. It is said that among the Cistercian monks there was Peter the Hermit, who became guardian of Goffredo di Buglioni. The monks remained in Orville until 1108, then disappeared suddenly. That they have returned to Italy following the Count's death. It is said that some monks had gone in search of the Holy Grail on holy ground, occupying the monastery of St. Mary of Sion. They were called by Goffredo di Buglioni, who founded the Knights of the Order of Our Lady in 1099 of Sion, which includes the Priory of Sion and the Templars. Precisely because of this historical fact, it is thought that Orville has guarded the Holy Grail. Ottone, Arnaldo's son, replaced the monks with a small community of religious coming from Trier, which completed the work of their predecessors. In 1124 the church was consecrated by Henri de Winton, Bishop of Verdun. Shortly afterwards the canons began to have economic difficulties and asked for affiliation to the of the Cistercians, which was booming at the time. In 1132 the Bishop of Verdun, Baron, uncle of the Count of Chiny, met Saint Bernard, who with his miracles was gaining fame and respect in the whole church. At the Council of Reims he communicated the desire of his pious nephew who was suffering to see the state into which the monastery poured. The request was accepted and Orville was affiliated to the oldest of the Cistercian abbeys, which is Trois-Fontaines in Champagne. On the 9th of March 1132 7 monks, under the guidance of Constantine, they came to Orville. Canons and monks merged into a single community and began to adapt the buildings to their use Cistercian, completing the church around 1200. The Cistercians were able to transform a poor area, unsuitable for agriculture, into a farm and a forest, making them self-sufficient according to the rule of the Cistercian order, orat et laborat. In 1132 the monks received as a gift a small estate of about 20 kilometers from the monastery, at Carignan, becoming one of the most beautiful farms in the area, that of Blanche-Champagne. Subsequently the monks were given other lands like Beurville-and-Sea, in the region of Meurthe and Moselle. Followed will become the center of Orville's iron industry. For 5 centuries Orville led a modest and quiet life, until 1252 when it came to the iron industry. Destroyed by fire, the territory now tormented by war and poverty, made it difficult to be reborn. Of the abbey, so much so that the monks decided to close the chapter at Orville for good. It would seem that the fate had been fierce with the monastery. In fact, the wars continued even between the 15th and 16th centuries, with France and Burgundy, and later between France and Spain, bringing destruction throughout the Luxembourg area. Charles V in 1529 granted the abbey the right to establish a foundry, which used the water that was in the vicinity of the monastery and the wood that came from the surrounding forest, becoming in a short time one of the most important foundries in Europe. The reconstruction of the nave of the church dates back to the beginning of the 16th century. The community counted 24 members, and in 1533 the church was consecrated. In the 17th century Orville lived a brilliant period. Bernard de Montgard, from the south of France, in spite of opposition from the community, became the abbot of Orville thanks to Archduke Albert 1605. He proved to be a good abbot, earning the respect of the monks. He was able to put the accounts of the monastery in order, restored the buildings, and was a forerunner of the reform. Trappist. In 1619 the community had 43 members, of which 27 consecrated monks, 8 lay brothers and 8 novices. The abbot Bernard was a very fussy and meticulous monk. He was often writing on writings the amount of beer and wine that the monks had to consume. It is assumed that the beer was brewed even before 1628, probably the first day of the monastery's existence. The abbot Bernard, after leaving the abbey at the height of its splendor, died in August 1637. At the height of the 30 Years' War, Marshal de Chatillon's troops plundered the monastery, that completely destroyed, leaving very little of it. It took decades before we saw the abbey again in its splendor. From 1668 to 1707, Orville had another great abbot, Charles de Bentherat, who was born in Echternach, Luxembourg. The reformist abbot, the one who introduced the model that Abbot Armand de Reims had made at the Abbey of Notre Dame de la Trappe in Normandy, establishing the observance strict. Charles was skillful and charismatic. In a short time he managed to introduce novices and founded the Abbey of Dusselthal in 1701, near the inn Dusseldorf, and to erect as priory the House of Conques, near the River Semois. After his death the monks of Orville sent reinforcements to the Abbey of Beaupré in Lorraine by reforming the monastery. In 1723 the community had 130 members and was the largest in the empire. In 1725, Jansenism became. He established himself in the community by destroying all the work carried out by Abbot Charles de Bentherat. About 15 monks went away and founded, near Utrecht, Holland, the religious house in Reinbeck. The community experienced a gloomy religious period, but economically flourishing, as agricultural and industrial estates continued to grow. At the end of the 17th century and the mid-18th century, the foundries of Orville were at the head of the iron and steel industry, and the earnings were allocated to the construction of a new monastery. And the project was entrusted to the famous architect Laurent Benoit de Wes, 1760. The new church was consecrated in 1782, then the works were completed. They stopped for lack of funds. In 1785 there was the return to the Cistercian rule, or atte laborit, allowing the monks to resume the path that God had appointed him. In 1789 the French Revolution broke out and all of Orville's possessions across the border were confiscated. The June 23, 1793, General Loyson's revolutionary troops sacked and burned a monastery, destroying the cloister and the 2 sanctuaries. Our Lady of Orville and St. Bernard were destroyed in retaliation for his hospitality to the Austrian troops. Orville was one of the most beautiful architectural works in Belgium, the Jewel of Belgium, whose arts are recalled decorative, created by Brother Gilson, a painter of rare skill. The works with the skillfully forged iron were completely destroyed, and the 60 monks had to take refuge in Luxembourg and the Priory of Conques. The community was officially suppressed on the 7th of November 1795, and the members of the community were forced to disperse. In 1793, the master brewer was Father Pierre, the last of Orval's brewers to be religious. In 1887, the de Haren family, Charles Albert de Haren and his wife Colin Waters, who held the landowners, and therefore also of Orval, invited to the castle Father Marie Albert van der Cruyssen, celler of the Abbey of the Great Trappist Abbey of Soligny, Abbot Jean-Marie Clare, the most illustrious minister Alois van de Viver and Baron Maurice Piermes, who was the vice-president of the Belgian Chamber of Representatives. After a long conversation decided to grant a part of their possessions, and among these also Orval, to the Cistercian community. The reconstruction did not begin until 39 years later, in 1926. When his nephew François de Haren took charge of the reconstruction work. In 1927, Jean-Baptiste Chotard, who was the abbot of Sept-Fonds, in the French region of Allier, was called to rebuild the monastic order. He sent a group of monks to Orval who knew of the recipe The Secret of the Trappers Port Salut cheese, which they re-proposed in Orval. The monks were helped by many religious Catholic intellectuals, art lovers from all over Belgium. Among the most illustrious was the patronage of the crown. The reconstruction was entrusted to Marie Albert van der Cruyssen from Ghent, a monk of the Abbey de la Trappe. Once the monastery was established, the architect Henry Vyse designed the abbey above the foundations of the 18th century abbey, which was conceived in the Romanesque style. These buildings form a harmonic complex combining spirituality and modernity. Orval resources in 1936, becoming autonomous. In 1944, Marie Albert was elected abbot, and on the 8th of September the church was consecrated. In 1955, Abbot Marie Albert died out, leaving the abbey in order and especially spiritual serenity. In the quiet of the forest, it is possible to retire to the monastery to carry out some spiritual serenity, spiritual retreats, in which the pilgrim can immerse himself in a place of peace and serenity. During the normal visit tourist, you can observe the ruins located near the church. In the outer perimeter of the abbey we find a garden with medicinal plants, a small hop garden and a pond. Of note is the facade of the basilica, which presents the statue of Mary holding the baby Jesus, a 17-meter work created by the sculptor Praise Vleeschouwer. In the museum, which is located in the lower part of the basilica, you can admire the paintings, fragments of sculptures, precious objects, historical books and a model reproducing the abbey. Still today, Orval keeps its magic unchanged, a real place of spirituality immersed in the modernity, where the sound of silence envelops our souls.